Hi everyone! Today in this video we are going to be talking about different types of sewing that you can do in CLO, how you can sew seams together, how we can sew our garments together to help create our garments once you've already created your pattern. And we're going to be going over the different types of sewing, including segment sewing, free sewing, and in sewing, and also how to edit that sewing too. This video will be broken up into a couple different parts, and so this part is going to be about segment sewing. With segment sewing, basically how segment sewing works is we'll be sewing one single segment to one single segment. And so basically what that means is a line between points to a line between points. So this would be one segment, this would be one segment, this would be one segment. Anything you highlight in CLO using the edit pattern tool highlights single segments at a time. And that's how basic segment sewing works, and we're going to use that on our dress pattern here. You can see I've got my dress pattern here. It's already arranged around my avatar, but with no sewing applied, so we need to go ahead and sew it together. So the segment sewing tool is located here in the 2D toolbar. It looks like this sewing machine icon with the single straight line below it. And when I click on that, I will go into sewing mode. I'm going to use segment sewing to first sew our shoulder seams together. And what I like to do in the 3D window is rotate and navigate to be able to see the seam I'm about to sew in the 3D window, and then actually do the sewing in the 2D window. Because when you highlight a seam in the 2D window, it also highlights it in the 3D window also. And you'll see when I hover over this pattern edge, I get a little notch that's attached to my mouse here, and it will move to whatever side of the segment that I'm closest to. This is basically telling me what side of the segment my notch or my sewing will start on. It doesn't really matter which side you start segment sewing on most of the time, but you'll just want to make sure that your notch or your sewing is being started on the same side for both halves of your seam. So for example, if I place my notch on this half of the shoulder seam closest to the neckline, then when I sew the back, I'll also want to place it closest to the neckline too. So to apply my segment sewing, I'm just going to click on the segment I want to apply the sewing to, and then jump over to the segment that I want it to be sewn to, hover over that one, and then click. And I'm going to click with it closer to the armhole since that's where I place the notch on the back. And now that sewing is applied. So we can do the same thing on our other shoulder seam. If we had a symmetric pattern, it would apply the sewing to both halves of our seam, but since we don't, we are going to add it manually to both sides. So now our shoulder seams are sewn together. Now we have our collar right here, and we can sew this together using segment sewing too, because it's one single segment to one single segment. So I'm going to click to place my notch closest to the center front, and do the same thing on the neckline on the front of the dress, and then jump to the other side and do that same thing too. I'll also sew my center front collar together using segment sewing. And now if I jump to my side seams, you can see that it would make me only be able to select one single segment at a time. So I wouldn't be able to sew the whole entire side seam together using regular segment sewing, which is a time we would either want to switch to free sewing, what we'll be talking about in our other video, or in segment sewing. And to get to in segment sewing, we're just going to hold down the segment sewing button and then locate in segment sewing beneath that. It starts out very similar to our segment sewing tool where we highlight a segment and see our notch on there. But with this one, instead of just clicking one single segment, in sewing allows us to select multiple segments or multiple pattern pieces. So I'm going to click and start my sewing at the armhole of my side seam on the front. So I'm just going to select this first segment. And then because we're in segment sewing, I can select multiple segments to continue this seam. So I'm going to jump down to the bottom half of the side seam, and I'll click, and I want to make sure my notch is closest to the side I left off on. So because I left off at the waist here, I want to make sure my notch is picking back up at the waist too, so not down here. And I'll click, And now, because I'm done with this half of the side seam, now I can click enter or return on my keyboard to let CLO know that I'm done with that half of the seam, and then I can jump to the other half. So now I'm going to jump to the other half of my side seam. I started at the armhole at the front, so I need to start at the armhole at the back. And if you're ever unsure if you're sewing the correct side seams together, you can always rotate in the 3D window to be able to see your avatar. So hovering over this side seam right here, I can tell that's correct, because if I hover over our other back side seam, I don't see those threads pop up. So that's an easy way to double check yourself. So I'm going to click to start that half of the seam, continue it down the side seam, and then once I'm done selecting those two parts, I'll click enter or return again, and that sewing is complete. I also have this rectangular pattern piece down here that's going to be gathered into our dress. And one thing that I can do right now is I didn't sew it together using in segment sewing on this seam to show you that you can just sew single pattern pieces together, but I'm going to rotate around to the other side and show you that you can also use in segment sewing to sew multiple pattern pieces together. So we're going to start out a similar way, still in segment sewing, clicking, continuing down, and this time instead of clicking enter to finish that half of the seam, I'm going to continue all the way down, including the rectangular panel in our side seam, and clicking again. And now I'm done with that half of the seam, so I can click enter or return, and I'll jump over to the back and do the other half of my seam. So because I started at the armhole in the front, I want to make sure I'm starting at the armhole in the back, placing my notch up there, continuing down, and then clicking down here to finish, and then clicking enter or return on my keyboard. And now that whole side seam is done. So with in segment sewing, you can include multiple segments or multiple segments and multiple pattern pieces. Since I didn't include that rectangular sewing in my first in segment sewing, I'm just going to use regular segment sewing to sew that together also. Now we have our seams created. I'm going to freeze our sleeves and our back collar because we are going to not do free sewing yet, and those would be much easier to use free sewing for. So I'm just going to click on our cursor here in the 3D window and select these seams that I don't want to move right now. I'm going to right click on them and click freeze. When I freeze something, they turn blue, and that basically is just going to make it not move when I simulate. And then I'm also going to freeze the back collar too, since we haven't sewn that together yet. And then we'll just finish sewing our rectangular pattern panel down here. So typically with a situation like this where we have a point here at the center of our dress pattern, but not a point here in our rectangular pattern piece, I would typically use free sewing for this because it would get rid of the need to get rid of this point. But if I really wanted to use segment sewing, I could either get rid of that point on the dress or add a point on my rectangular piece. But for this, I could actually also use in segment sewing and sew that along the bottom, click enter. And then since I started on the left with my notch, then I'll also start on the left with my notch on the rectangular piece and click enter. Because that one had a point here, that's why I used in segment sewing, but the back actually doesn't have a point on it, so I could use segment sewing too. But if there's a time when you could use regular segment sewing and you use in segment sewing, it doesn't hurt anything, it just takes a couple extra clicks. So our sewing looks pretty good. We're just missing our back collar and our sleeves. So simulation might be a little different than what it would be when we're done, but I just want to show you what simulation will look like with this sewing since we've sewn it all together before we go on to the next video and do free sewing to finish it up. So I'm going to turn on simulation mode by clicking spacebar. And our dress is simulated. So we have the gathering down here at the bottom, and then our dress sewn together. If I wanted to switch into high res mode, I could click the high res button here in the 3D toolbar and click OK. And then I could turn on simulation. And see those gathers fall a little bit more realistically. And so that's the basics of our segment sewing and MN segment sewing tools. In the next video, we're going to finish up sewing this dress together, and we're going to use free sewing and MN free sewing. And I'm also going to show you how you can edit your sewing or fix it if something's wrong. And there's also a couple of spaces where you'll see we can use free sewing or segment sewing. You have the option to use both, and so it will be kind of up to whatever you prefer. So keep watching part 2.